So when you look at the finances associated with them, how do you know how much money to ask for? And I'll start with Mike first, because Genomenon was our favorite company name to say at the University of Michigan Tech Transfer Office. I think Robin Racer used to walk around singing Genomenon, and you know the song. So anyway,
yeah.
So how do you know how much money to ask for, Mike?
I think a lot of what you need to think about at the very early stages is milestone driven. Where can you get a lot of what you think about, especially in software, is you can make a lot of progress, but the big milestone is product market fit. So what can you do to get, in the case of software, a minimum viable product, so an MVP, in the hands of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 customers that actually can validate that it provides value, that's something that they want to buy. That's probably the biggest driver. So a lot of that goes into software development costs. In a very early stage, your CEO is likely, or your chief scientific officer is likely to be your salesperson, your key salesperson that's reaching out to meet with those customers. So I would say, that is probably the big driver from a software perspective, because once you show you got product market fit, that next level of fundraising, I won't say it's easy, but it's a little easier.
And so in reverse order then, Jeff, I think, when you look at a software-enabled technologies, there's the product market fit. And then there's also break even, when do you start making money with that? So how, again, trying to tee this into, all right, we're gonna go start asking for money. How do we know how much to ask for?
Yeah. So a lot of us, the way we think about it, and I actually want to momentarily acknowledge your diversity question. I know that Jen Baird was first asked, who's the CEO and super experienced, and would have brought great diversity to the panel. She unfortunately couldn't be here and knows I live and breathe the financial model every day. But the attempt was made by NEF to have diversity. And I'll put a plug in for anyone that wants to learn about Jen's thinking to check out her blog. It's called Startup CEO Reflections.
Great point.
And it has just wonderful wisdom. I've been working with Jen for 10 years, and I still learn from reading her own blog. And she had a great piece about raising money just last week that talks about that. So to your question, it's a lot about triangulation, which is first, what are the folks you're raising money from, and what's their appetite? So if you're looking at angels, you're only going to raise a certain amount of money versus VCs versus private equity. Then you look in the middle and you're talking about what is that milestone and how much time do you need and how much are you going to burn to get to that milestone. And then you look at the exit and what time frame and how much money you need to raise in order to get a reasonable exit, because people want a multiple on the back end. And you put all those together and it guides you to how much you can ask for at each of those stages.
So we're going to come back to that reasonable exit question in a little bit. I think that is a really important aspect of putting yourself in your investor's shoes. But John, I think, if I look back at one of my first weeks at University of Michigan and a therapeutic drug was being presented to the team, and the question was, how much do you charge for the drug? And it just made my head pop thinking about, you've got an early stage therapeutic, you don't even know if it works yet, and we're trying to figure out before we've done patient trials at all what to charge for the thing. So you unpack all of that and say, all right, how much money are you going to ask for? How do you do that with a therapeutic? What are your inflection points that you're driving for?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I'll try to add value to what Jeff and Mike have said, because it's really, all businesses are kind of the same when you're thinking about how much money you raise. You want to raise money to get somewhere, right? To get somewhere that's meaningful. And I also frame this a little bit is, how much money do you raise? Well, it's enough. It's enough to get somewhere. It's also enough to meet people's expectations. So if I say I'm going to develop a drug and get it to market for $10 million, I am laughed out of the room. So I need to match expectations of what does it take to get from point A to point B. And I love hearing people say, yeah, but I'm going to be really efficient. We're going to do it differently and we're going to do it better. And there's reasons there's market averages. Now, you might do it different, but you better have a really good story that is backed up. So, to me, a lot of this is, it's just got to be enough. And, in clinical drug development, the answer is we have to get to, the pivotal endpoints are, have you proved that the drug works in animals? And have you proved to some level that it works in human? And those are the two big inflection points. And if you're successful, you're most likely going to get acquired, the license will get taken up, or you'll be on a path to a pretty fast IPO, because drugs that work make a lot of money, and 90% of them don't work, and that's the end of the story.
When we heard the presentation earlier from Iran, it was interesting to hear how it was a long period of time to raise funding. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, that you have a lot of shots on goal, and a lot of times with the same investor, and your finances kind of leave fingerprints behind. And, the first presentation that you had is likely going to be something they refer to if they're going to have take a second meeting. And so, Mike, how do you build credibility into your finances after that initial meeting with investors?
So I think there's a couple of things to think about. The first is obviously the top down, how big is the market? The question that all investors ask. But you can really, to go in, you can't go in and say, I'm going to get 1% of this market. So then you've got to do the bottom up build. You've got to think about what's your sales cycle and get an idea. Are you able to sell this and turn this on in 1 month, or are you in a lengthy sales cycle that could be 18 months? Because that's going to impact the amount of cash you're burning. It's also going to impact how fast you can ramp up the customers and ramp up the revenue. You need to think through that sales model of how do salespeople, if you're, depending on whether you're using channels or you're selling direct, how many customers can your salespeople realistically talk to and land, and what does that pipeline look like? And model that out so you get a good idea of what that revenue ramp looks like, modeled with the cost or the expenses of your salespeople and all the support that goes with that. So what I mean by support is field application scientists or field application sales engineers, your marketing team, and then you have your infrastructure costs, your development costs, your G&A, that all goes into building that model. I think that so you start building that model, and then you think about, how do I actually put this into reality? Because it's pretty easy to look out and say, okay, I get the next 12 months and I can probably build a model for the next 24. But what about years 3, 4, and 5? Because it's a hand wave, it's a guess. And I can build that top line number pretty easily. What I tend to do is when I build by quarters for the first 2 years. But when I look at years 3, 4, and 5, I'm looking at, going to John's point, I'm looking at industry averages. I'm looking at, what are the typical models that are out there for what a software company or a software in the healthcare company in the healthcare space is going to do. What percent of sales do they have at our levels in sales? What percent of their revenue do they spend in marketing? What do they spend in G&A, for example? And I build my model out from that perspective, because that brings a sense of realism. You're not saying, hey, I'm going to have 50% EBITDA or profit on the bottom line, especially when you have a fast growing company. So that's a little bit of how you can start to, how at least I think about building the credibility from that bottom up story and then that modeling in the latter years.
And then, Jeff, when you're looking at selling technology into a hospital system or getting clinical support on a technology like Fifth Eye, I would imagine it's not a direct line from minimally viable product to your 10th customer. How do you keep your investors engaged as you start to learn how to get into those systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the keys is to put your financial fundraising out of alignment with, and by meaning out of, not directly at the same time as you're making major milestones, so that you have time from the time you raise the money to accomplish the next task. So we raise money, and then we can go all in on getting the FDA. Then we raise more money, and we can go all in on getting commercial traction. Right? And then you go raise more money for the B round and go in. And as long as they're out of alignment, you have that time to support that next raise. And so what we've learned now that we've gotten our FDA, we've got to start the commercial path. And as you mentioned, Jack, that commercial path is never straight because selling into a hospital environment is a complex sell. I came out of automotive. I also did some time in utilities. These are all complex sells, non-consumer oriented. And so how we convince someone to say, great, you have a de novo, but what's the utility of it? And oh, by the way, I have 5 people that need to sign the PO, and 6 of them are distracted out of those 5. So it just is infinitely challenging. And so what we do is we try to under-promise and over-deliver. So we've said, hey, first year, we're not going to get that much traction. What it means to be successful the first year is to have traction. Get a sale, get a few sales, so that in the second year, you have enough traction to build on that you can raise that next round. So we don't want to raise money in 12 months. You want to be able to say we have 2-year runway in the healthcare space, because you can't promise what's going to happen in those first 12 months. It's almost impossible.
That's really, by the way, Jeff, you've said done time a couple times with a couple of the companies you've worked for. So I just have that sensitivity to, being imprisoned at work, but so I get it. I did time at Michigan. I did when I was an undergrad in the tech transfer office.
Yeah.
John, I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball at you. And again, really starting to look at building that credibility. And one of the most interesting questions I heard an investor ask a founder before was, what if I gave you 5 times more money than you're asking for? What does that do to your plan? What do you think they're asking? What do you think they're inspecting when they're looking at your finances?
Well, that's a great question, Jack, because I ask every single person I mentor or think about investing in the exact same question. I do want to if I can jump back and be controversial to a couple of things.
Sure,
that
absolutely.
Mike and Jeff said. I think we're really great. I think the idea of having a model is really essential, and I always do that with full knowledge that the model is going to be wrong, but it's a model. And it's a model there. I can change a variable. So if my sales cycle actually turns out to be 18 months, not 6 months, I can change that and everything changes. And I get to see that impact and I can play with that. And investors can argue with me and we can look at it and we can play with it and come to resolution. So a model, regardless of how accurate it is hugely valuable. And then trying to predict what's going to happen the first year that you're selling something, whether it's the first year you're selling your investment to raise money or it's the first year you're trying to sell a product. I think it's almost impossible to predict when the ramp, the hockey stick's going to start. It's okay to have a hockey stick, but that hockey stick can be off by 12 months, which is what happened with Compendia. Earlier in the career, we were off by a full 12 months, and then we hit our projections for every year thereafter. We just had to shift it a year. So those are a couple really good points that I think that we can build on. And why do investors ask what can you do with 5 times more? I think it's because entrepreneurs, especially early people with early startups, and I want to say people who live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and my friend Diogo, who's on here from Lisbon, Portugal, they only think that they can raise a certain amount of money, so that's what they set their expectation to and their business plan to. And an investor wants to know, well, if you had 5 times more, what would could you do more? Could you do something more meaningful? And I've been asked that question a lot. And sometimes the answer is not, I wouldn't do it differently now. Now, if you want to give me 5 times more in a year, then I think we can leverage it, but we can only run so fast and do so much and expand so much in a certain amount of time because you've got to lay track, right? Once you lay some track, you can start moving a lot faster. So sometimes the answer is, if you've got track laid, I can run a lot faster, a lot further down more paths if you give me 5 times more money. But sometimes the answer is, I can only use this much for the next 12 months, and then let's talk about the big investment, or we do a tranched investment, or whatever you want to do it. But sometimes the right answer is nothing more than I've just told you.
Yeah. And
I think that's the right answer anyway.
That's how you like to hear people answer you when you ask that question. And maybe it was you that asked that question, and it was the first time I'd heard it. It's a great question. I've used it many times. Hey, Mike, I think the difference in the types of technologies dictate the different types of funding that we ask for. How did you right size that for Genomenon relative to the stage of investing, the timing of investing, the use of funds? How do you square that with the financial projections? And, you know, kind of going back to what I want to circle back with Jeff, what does the investor need to get out of that investment, the multiple of investment?
Okay, there's a couple of questions there. You know, I think you know, there's the ideal scenario, which is I'm going to ask for this much, I'm going to get this much, I'm going to hit this milestone, I'm going to ask for this much, I'm going to hit the next milestone. Then there's the reality, and the reality is you take as much as you can get. And if an investor's offering you twice as much, or you think you can raise twice as much as you need, the reality is that your business plan is 50% wrong. You don't know which part is 50% wrong, and you're going to make mistakes. You're going to miss milestones. Things are going to happen that you didn't expect. And as entrepreneurs, we're all optimistic. We all like to think of the best case scenario, but the financial part of you needs to think of the worst case scenario. So often I think about two things. I think about having a forecast that I share with my investors of here's where we're going, and then having a budget that, especially in the software world, when you're in market, you can trim based on what the market adoption is. So if you think you're going to sell 2 million this year and you reality sell 1 million this year, well, you're going to run out of cash really quick if you only raise $2 million. You need to start thinking about, you know, trimming, or put the other way, turning on those resources when you start hitting the milestones in your budget that says, okay, I'm hitting these revenue benchmarks. I feel comfortable hiring that next salesperson or adding that next software developer. So you kind of, you live in this two sets of worlds of, hey, here's a forecast of where we can go. As John said, here's my hockey stick, right? And here's where we're going to get to. But then the other half, you have to live in the reality of, but I'm not going to outspend my budget, because when your cash hits zero, it's game over. And so you always need to manage to that mind. At least I always manage that mindset of being cautious of thinking of, I'm not going to spend the plan. I'm going to make sure I'm monitoring my revenues to plan and then spend in my revenue.
Go ahead, Mike, finish your thought.
I say, so you had a second question in there, but I can't remember what
it doesn't matter. So I think that I want to stay with you for a second, because what you brought up was a really good point. And I think you've demonstrated a really interesting skill for a founder. And that is, you know, you're able to articulate, you know, what the finances mean, but you're also wrapping around that the fact that you also had the experience that, hey, look, I know what I'm giving you today doesn't reflect what's going to be there 6 months. You know, one of the questions that we kicked around was, why do a 5-year projection when we know 90 days from now it's all going to be out of line? Now, how do you articulate what you just articulated to us in a formal presentation with investors? And you're like, I'm committed to this number, but darn it, I know it's wrong, right? How do you come across and tell that so they know that you're real?
You know, so one of the traps that investors will lay out is in some cases they'll say, will you commit to this number, and can we put ratchets around or other financial penalties if you don't hit those numbers? And that's really a really difficult spot to be as in an entrepreneur, and I won't agree to that. As a young entrepreneur, sometimes you can fall into that trap, but the reality is we just don't know. These are forecasts, these are present, these are and we don't know what the, you know, Genomenon, the market adoption, we had a lot of, you know, talk to the hand in our first couple of years. People said, bullshit, this won't work, I'm not going to buy it. And then as we got the adoption and the bigger players started coming in, you know, we're in over 1,000 labs in 118 countries right now. And that ramp up happened 2 years later than we thought, but now it's starting to take off. You know, to John's point, right? Where's that hockey stick, and where's the timing going to happen? So I think, you know, I come, because I have the experience, I think I'm able to articulate that this is where it's going, but quite frankly, this is our best guess. This is where we're going to go, and look at the financials and how we've managed the business to date to show you that we will be good stewards of your capital to get to where we need to go, even if our estimates are wrong. And at the end of the day, the investors are betting on the management team that you've got the experience and the capability to manage through this world of the unknown with a strong vision of where you want to go, but the tactical capabilities to get through the day-to-day of, you know, stuff's going to hit you in the face that you need to react to.
And, you know, Jeff, I think Mike alluded to a really interesting point, and that is that, The old saying, it always takes twice as long and twice as much money to do what you're planned to do initially. How do you keep credibility with your finances when that happens? What do you tell an investor as you're going through that?
So the financial model leads me to a word. It's trust. I mean, it's a Scrabble word that is always a triple word score. I mean, it's just a crazy valuable word that you're trading on when you're in raising money. And the financial model is the foundation of that trust because it's something that everybody can relate to. They may not understand the core of your technology, but they know how to read a financial statement. Somebody there does. And so for us, you can often be late, but you shouldn't need twice as much. Or you can need twice as much, but go twice as fast. To do both is troublesome. And so that's where we start to bend that trust. And for us, it's a real war story. We just raised our Series A back in 2019. And it was on the premise that we were going to do a 510K with the FDA for our medical device. After 6 months, the FDA said, I'm sorry, but you're so novel, there is no predicate, and therefore you can't do a 510K. You're going to have to do a de novo. The reality is we probably couldn't have raised our Series A if we knew we were going to have to do de novo because it was viewed as too risky. But here we were in that space. And so we had saved our financial model in such a way that we had triggers that we weren't going to pull until we hit certain milestones, especially on the sales and marketing front, to protect our cash. And so as a result, it took a full extra year to get to FDA approval than we anticipated, so 100% more. But because we didn't pull the levers, we didn't have to go back for more money in order to reach that milestone. And then to maintain credibility, we communicated with the board on a monthly basis and with investors on a quarterly basis that was predictable and repeatable in terms of how it looked. So we were maintaining that transparency throughout.
I think Jeff
go ahead, Mike.
A really good point there, which is this isn't just a black and white numbers game. This is about trust and transparency. You're going to have good, you're going to have bad, you're going to have ugly. And you need, I think if you're communicating that, if you're saying this is what's different from our model, this is what we've learned, this is how we're reacting to it, and you're just laying it out there, you're going to build a lot of trust with your investors that are sitting there saying, okay, we knew there was a lot of uncertainty here, but the management team is acting and reacting in a reasonable fashion, and we believe in their story going forward.
Yeah, I think that same.
Go ahead, John.
So now we're just having a discussion, Jack. You've lost control. I mean, and I think that that trust and transparency starts the day you meet an investor, and it's sort of to a little bit to your case, Mike. I mean, you have a model, you have a plan, and it's probably not true or it's a lot not true, and if you're upfront and honest about that, but you have identified, where the risk is, where might it go wrong? What are the different things that can go wrong that you're planning for and you're aware of and that you're measuring? And you start that at day one. And then once they invest, you continue that every day after that. When the environment changes, when a competitor arises, when, whatever happens, you're communicating it in real time. And again, predictably. Investors don't like surprises, but they can handle disappointment. And, and I think that's kind of, really key and central. So, especially for, younger people getting into the startup world and they're going to go talk to their first investor, too much enthusiasm. Well, enthusiasm's great. Too much optimism feels naive. And, you really need to, and people think that you can't tell the bad news or the potential bad news or the risks to investors. And actually that's, I think, really, really critical, especially to angel investors and the such, because angel investors become a really personal relationship. And it's absolutely critical.
Can I go, John?
Yes, sir.
So I think one of the things that we're starting to navigate away from a little bit is investors want a return, right? I mean, we're talking about kind of the softer side of finances. We're talking about when we have a miss, and I know I'm the one who's driving that conversation, but I think that one of the things that we have to come back to is those investors want a return on investment. And I think that the projections that you use initially Oftentimes, depends on the sophistication of the investor, they're kind of taking that to the bank. They're kind of taking that 27% IRR and 3x return or whatever it's going to be. They're taking that to the bank. Well, if you do an IRR, time is money. I mean, it's going to cost you over time. And I guess, what I was going to ask you about, John, when you look at that, especially in a therapeutics, right? I mean, it does take an awful long time, and you can't rush the science. I mean, you just can't fake it. If you can't get a lead, you can't get a lead. And so, you've got to talk investors off the edge when you say it's going to be another 9 months or it's going to be another 18 months. What tools in your financial quiver can you point to mix metaphors that will allow you to, really help calm them down?
Yeah, so you've got two completely different investors in therapeutics. And, sometimes it's angel versus institutional investor. You're focused on return like a fine institutional investor, CIO check. But for a lot of investors, early angel investors in therapeutics, it's all about the mission. It's all about the possible benefit to patients. It's very mission driven, and they hope that there's a return that's meaningful, and they know that if there is, it's really meaningful. And when I talk to angel investors in therapeutics, I'm awfully blunt. It's like this is not for the the lighthearted. Therapeutics fail a lot. But the only thing I can promise you is that what we learn will be shoulders for someone else to stand on if we don't make it. We will advance the field through good science, and it might not work. And so, if angels have invested in companies, therapeutic companies that I've been involved in, and many others, that really has to be the position that they get in with, because they're likely to get crammed down even with success. Some can get good returns, but it's really hard to be an angel investor in a therapeutic company. And then you have the other folks who invest, and to be frank, they should know better. It's institutional investors or more sophisticated investors in biotech. They know the risks. They know that the timelines slide. They know that science fails all the time, but when it works, the returns are enormous. So they're going to mix their portfolio so they don't have 5 super risky opportunities, and that's why they're professional investors or institutional investors. But so it's two very different stories on the therapeutic side.
One of the things that we have had the luxury of during the pandemic is the opportunity to do meetings like this with investors across the country and, John, around the world. Have the three of you, when I ask all three of you the same question, have you seen differences in the way they look at finances, the way they look at your income statement between California and Boston and Austin, Texas, or the Midwest? And Jeff, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah. So most of my experience is in the Midwest, and that's because that's where I feel like I know the language. I know the path I want to take that may not resonate as well, especially on the West Coast. Some success on the East Coast. You find your niche. I'm starting to feel that I'm not going to be a therapeutics guy. I know I like the medical device. I have a path where, in my mind, I go look for a product that's going to be started, and I'm going to raise an angel. It's going to be convertible. It's going to be between $1 and $2 million because that's an angel space. We're going to hit a milestone that starts as we're ready for commercial. We're going to get an A that's going to be somewhere between 5 and 10 million, because that's a sweet spot for A's of the VC size that we're speaking with. And we're going to get some commercial traction. You're going to get a B that will be between, say, 8 and 15 million. And then a total raise of, say, 20 to 30 million. And then you're going to get commercial success that starts generating some cash or showing trajectory to go global with a market cap proven. And you're going to be at revenue of, say, between 20 and 50 million, and get a multiple out of about 200 million out the back end. That gives your investors, hopefully, between 4 and 10x. And that is not surprisingly so very similar to how Accuracytometer went for Jen, and it worked well for her. It's how we're raising, the path we're trying to take now. And we look at opportunities, we say, do we see a story that fits that path? Because that's the sweet spot for the people that we know. And we know the people in the Midwest the best. So we're not trying to be the unicorn. It's good to know who you are and who you aren't. And that's the path that we're trying to follow. And it's and therefore we have fun because we don't have to pretend something we're not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Mike, how about you? Countrywide differences in financial personality?
Yeah, very, very different. So, you know, when we're in the Midwest and you say we're looking to raise $5 million, or why do you need so much money for a software company? And then we go to the West Coast, you say you're looking to raise 10 million. They're like, only $10 million. You don't have a big enough picture. You're not going for it. You don't have a big enough vision of where you want to go. So there's very, very different kind of expectations, risk profiles that we see between, that I see between, you know, in the same market between West Coast investors, Midwest investors, and the East Coast investors are probably closer to the West Coast investors. They're not as pragmatic or pushing you as hard as the Midwest investors, but they're also looking for bigger numbers as well. So I see a very different appetite, very different set of expectations. And at one point I was advised to have a $5 million plan, a $10 million plan where we're doing our Series A. And I finally just threw in the towel and said, you know what, I can't tell two stories. You know, to Jeff's point, this is who we are. This is what I want. This is where we want to go. If you like this profile, then we're the right ones. But if you're looking for somebody who's going to be the next unicorn, Genomenon's not going to be the next unicorn. That's just not us.
You know, it just continues to remind me of dating. Not that I'm happily married 33 years, but every time I hear stories like that, it's like, this is who I am, if you love it or not. So, John, same question. I mean, and you've got an interesting perspective with, you know, some international flair. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's some international flair, but really, you know, just to be the three therapeutic companies, I guess four, but the three therapeutic companies that I've led and worked on financings for, you know, one was very Midwest focused. That was the last one with O&L, where we were just getting started and it wasn't ready for coastal VCs. And those financials, those were reviewed down to the line item. And again, it's important to have it, but you know, those got reviewed down to the line item. When I was raising some significant rounds, we actually got commitments. The deals didn't get pulled off to raise 30, 40 million around a couple different projects with a couple different companies that were going to be funded by West Coast VCs. You know, the financial plan was sitting around a table on a napkin. You know, I had a plan, I had a number, but they just sort of back checked it. Okay, you're running a trial of this many patients over this period of time. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, you need about 20 million, don't you, for that study? And then, oh yeah, you need about 10 million for that study. That's good enough for now. You know, and now let's figure out if the science really has a chance of success. Now, if I had gone in and said I need 5 million, it would have been game over because it's just not true. So, you know, knowing that, you know, the amount of 18 million to 20 million, that's devil in the details when you're at that level, right? And the reality is that's not 2 million and more people salary. That's like, oh, do we need another 50 patients for this study? So, you know, depending on the business that you're in, it really, like, how sensitive your financials are to like your operating plan or your internal overhead and things like that. That's what people really care about, is how much are you spending on overhead. That, you know, so that's a huge difference that I've seen, you know, in the bigger VCs. And the truth is that they want opportunities, not necessarily that you're not dreaming big enough, but if I can't get rid of 10% of my 400 million fund over the course of my investment in you,
yeah,
then, you know, I can't talk to you.
That was probably one of the most eye-opening things for me, that when some of the billion-dollar funds were saying no to our companies at the University of Michigan, it wasn't because anything was bad, it's because they couldn't put enough money to work for them. And I think it's really important that you understand why, you know, who you're talking to, right? And to your point, John,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, you
Jack, I made
it. Say, well, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jeff.
You follow up on the. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, I was going to just build on Jack. You hit on the dating, and I'm going to come back to it because it's not just dating; it's actually speed dating. You know, you're sitting here as a company rep, and they're sitting there as VC. I say hello, they say goodbye. You know, it's because what you're looking for. You see so many deals, you're looking actually for the disconnect. Are you looking for someone that's not like me? Am I looking for someone that's not like you? Because as a VC, you want a certain investment. You have this much money to deploy at this time. I need an exit now. I have this kind of company I want to run, which isn't just to feel like a medical device, but we talked to some VCs that wanted someone in their 20s that was going to sleep on a couch and get paid $50,000 a year. Well, Jen and I are now more mature, let's say, and we're in a place that we bring experience with that. But we're not going to do it sleep on a couch, you know, 60 hours a week for 50,000. And so it's a philosophical match. Neither one is right or wrong. It's, do we have alignment? And that's the speed dating aspect of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, you know, as an entrepreneur to be able to do to do that when you're talking to a fund, like you said, Jack. You know, right out the bat, think about how much you're trying to raise in the size of the fund and rule them out. And don't, you know, if you're doing that speed dating or you're having that first meeting, you should not be afraid to ask them, what's the size of their fund? How much do they have deployed? Where, you know, how many more investments are they looking to make? What's the average size of their investment? What's their first check? And don't be afraid to check out after that first meeting. Be very nice. But, you know, one of the challenges is that I think young entrepreneurs face is that most investors don't want to tell you to go pound sand. They're going to be nice to you. They're going to be happy. The really good investors will and say, hey, you're just not a good fit. But there are 50% of the investors that will give you a happy talk. And inexperienced entrepreneurs can spend a lot of time listening to that happy talk, chasing up those leads, calling, and you get no answer. Yeah. So it's important to, you know, to be just as selective on our side as the entrepreneur as it is for the investors to be selective.
Yeah. John, you want to add something to that? Go ahead.
Well, I just, you know, to sort of to this whole, like, how big's their fund and where are they in their life cycle? I did ask this question years ago and I was like, you know, I need to get rid of 10% of my fund. You know, I'm only going to invest in 10 companies. And it's like, why not? If there's 15 good companies, why don't you invest in 15? And the answer was, you know, how many boards do you think I can sit on and be productive? Yeah. How many, you know, and I have to go raise a new fund. And it's like, thinking about what's the life of a venture capitalist and what's their job every day look like, and then you can sort of imagine why some of these rules are true, that they can only be spread so thin. And then, you know, so it's like put your feet in their shoes. You do that with an angel investor, you do that with an institutional investor, and you try to understand really quickly when they are giving you the signs that they're bored or this isn't a match, right, Jeff, in your speed dating, you have some idea of why that might be. And you can sort of, to Mike's comments, you can ask them bluntly, are you not interested because of this? And if you ask them bluntly, they'll tell you the blunt truth. But sometimes you have to ask for it.
And Lee is the manifestation of the Emmy Awards winning music that is happening, so that we have to wind down our comments, but do some Q&A now. And I don't know if you've got any, Lee. I do see one from Diogo on
there
the
are 5.
chat. Okay, I can see one of them. So go ahead with.
Well, thank you, Jack. I actually hate to break in because I'm loving this conversation you guys are having. It is really, really good, enlightening, lots of good information. But there are some good questions here too. I'm going to throw the first one to Keith because you kind of spoke to this. When you're building your early pro forma, how bullish should you be?
I think that's for Michael, actually.
Or for me?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay.
You think so? I was going to give it to Keith, but, you know, I think they could all have something to say for it. But you want to give it to Mike, that's fine. I'm easy.
Well, there isn't a Keith on the panel unless you're going someplace else. I think you're looking at Mike's last name there, Lee. So
actually, I was thinking Jeff. Why I said Keith, I want you all to know that my 11th Zoom meeting of the day. I am a Zoomie.
That's right. You did say that. So I give you so Mike. So Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, give it to Mike. Mike volunteered.
Jeff,
I was volunteered.
Jeff, how bullish should you be when you're building your early pro forma?
Okay. I'm going to take it and think about my middle name. So, you know, I'm going to come back to, it's not about bullish. I think it is about connecting the dots between the reality of what the market has to offer and what you think you can accomplish and what you need in order to raise next money, and say, does it work? Can you explain it? That justifies the bullishness. Is, do you have a reasonable path that everyone knows won't go straight there, but is understandable at this point in time? And if you can explain it at this point in time, then you should use those numbers. And if those numbers justify the next raise, then you have a business potential.
Ah, I love it. That's good. Thank you very much, Jeff, Keith, or whatever.
My pleasure.
Now, I will throw the next one to Mike, because this was specifically for you. Where can one find comparables, data, Ray, margin, sales cycle for years 3, 4, and 5 of a startup?
Oh, great question. So, yeah, there's a couple of sources, especially in the software business. You know, there's a number of companies that have, or profiles out there on SaaS metrics, software as a service metrics. And so you can go in and look up SaaS metrics, and there are a ton of reports typically provided by investors, whether it's venture debt companies or whether it's software investors, that will actually give you those metrics. And they'll say, hey, here's what the growth, it's literally growth versus how much you're spending in sales, how much you're spending in marketing, what the typical profile is, and how that breaks out across the P&L. So those are pretty readily available just with a couple of Google searches into some of these SaaS metrics databases.
All right, thank you. John, since you've pitched to so many different investors, are you tailoring the financials to each investor you pitch to?
No. You know,
the nuclear option.
I don't know who's going to say, I have no idea who's going to say yes, and I better have the right plan at the right time. No, you know, with different investors, we might spend more time on the financials than with other investors, but the financials, you know, they are what they are.
Yeah, I want to support John on that. I mean, you got to live with these financials. So the big mistake is when entrepreneurs think they pitch financials, get the money, and then don't have to report financials ever again. You've got to connect your accounting books to your Excel spreadsheet, to your PowerPoint pitches, to your PDFs, and they've got to flow from your reality to your executives, to your board of directors, to your investors. And they all have to be contiguous from one round to the next. And if you can't be changing the numbers in the same round and be credible, it all started with back to the trust as a triple word score. You'll destroy it out of the gate.
All right, well, Jeff, I'm going to follow up with you with another question, and that is, how much work should we really put into the financial forecast beyond 2 years?
Yeah, that's good. I think that the big money does go in, the big time should go into the 2 years. And then you are focusing more on the path after that. So I think it's less work, and you're saying, hey, as Mike said, there's numbers that need to be hit in terms of the multiples of the growth rates. You're going to plug and chug a lot of that and say, does it make sense once again? But I'm looking months to quarters in the first 2 years that are with the bulk of my time.
All right, thank you. We have a question about whether there are any strategies, and I'll throw this out to all of you, strategies or tips to handle the challenges entrepreneurs have while designing and improving the business model. You know, forecasts can change, things can change. So what should you do with your business model as that's going on?
So one of the, especially in the software world that I live in, there's a lot of testing of the business model. You know, it's not only testing the software, but you're testing your pricing. So when you're, you know, fresh out the chute, you're going to make a guess on what your price is going to be. I'll give you an example. At Genomenon, we went in, and when I listened to, and I first came onto the company, I listened to the value proposition. We can save, you know, we could quintuple a molecular pathologist efficiency. They're making $200,000 a year. So it seemed to make a lot of sense to me that we could charge $50,000 a seat. Well, we got laughed out of the marketplace. We sold a couple of 25,000, but over time we adjusted that down to, I think we're just under $5,000 a user per year, so per seat. Your business model is probably wrong, and you're going to be figuring that out as you go along. I think the most important thing is, I would recommend that you got to own your financials and know your financials, and you got to own the customer relationship and know those customers and be in up to your elbows in both of those, because they're closely tied and you're going to be navigating your way through that. I don't know there's any tricks to it. You can't outsource your financials, and you can't outsource talking to those customers and understanding what the market wants. So it probably isn't like a trick or a strategy that I could share. Maybe Jeff has a trick.
Well, Mike, I completely agree with you in terms of not outsourcing. So my trick is, the beauty of a small company is you get to wear all the hats. And so I run the finances, but I've also, with Jen, I'm also the head of customer success. So because of that, I'm the guy that they call when they have problems. And I also have to do the billing because I'm in accounting. And so that gets a connection. The business model has to be substantiated because I'm living with the customer. If they're not succeeding, I'm failing as customer success head. And that has to connect back to the models. And the beauty is you can figure that all out while you're small, and you can wear those hats before I have to hire a customer success leader.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll just jump in from a therapeutics perspective, because it's pretty different in that, you don't have customers that you're actually interacting with, and you probably won't in the lifetime of your company. But your customer is your investor. And I know this, to some extent, I mean, this is especially important in therapeutics. You don't want to outsource it, but you want to have really battle-hardened people around the table. And again, that might be an NEF coach, but whoever it is, you want some people around the table that have been through it, because in the therapeutic space, things do change quite a lot. And what you're really trying to figure out is not what's the price of your drug, because everyone knows it's going to be a lot if you're successful. And the question is are you going to make 1 billion or 5 billion a year? So it's like you sort of put some financial questions aside, but the question is what's the value of companies from a exit perspective if they've got this kind of data? So what you're trying to predict is this a 200 million exit, or is it a 1 billion exit? And how does that affect your financing plan? And again, what's your IRR on that from an investor? So, I think with each different business case, the financial pieces that matter are different. And you really need to know how much is it going to cost to get to this inflection point from a drug development standpoint, which is still going to allow an investor to get the 5-10x return that they're expecting to get.
Well, you guys have been absolutely terrific. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the questions. So thank you all very much. And I will, Jack, do you have any last words, or do you want me to just turn it right back to Paul?
I have no last words. Thank you all very much. The panel was great. And thank you, Lee and Francis. Appreciate it.